The trench systems that defined the Western Front during World War I were complex feats of military engineering, evolving over the course of the war from simple improvised defensive positions to sophisticated multi-layered fortifications. At the outset of the war in 1914, both the Allied and Central Powers forces expected a war of rapid maneuver and decisive battles. However, as their attempts to outflank each other failed, the armies found themselves locked in a stalemate, forced to dig in and hold their ground. The initial trenches were relatively basic, dug hastily by soldiers using whatever tools were available. These early trenches lacked many of the sophisticated features that would later characterize the trench systems, such as traverses, dugouts, and communication trenches. According to pre-war military doctrine, the trenches were intended to be temporary, with the armies still expecting to resume the offensive. As the stalemate on the Western Front dragged on, the trench systems became increasingly elaborate and permanent. Soldiers began reinforcing the walls of the trenches using materials like wood, tree posts, and sandbags filled with clay. Duckboards were laid across the floors to prevent the trenches from becoming waterlogged. The trenches were often constructed at night by specialized engineer units in order to have the defenses in place before the enemy could attack. The layout of the trenches also became more sophisticated, with a zigzag pattern designed to minimize the damage from artillery bombardments. A typical defensive trench system on the Western Front consisted of 3 parallel lines of trenches spaced about 800 yards apart. The fire trench was the frontline trench where soldiers engaged in combat, whether through sniping, raiding, or full-scale assaults. The support trench was located behind the fire trench, providing additional firepower and reinforcements to the front line. The reserve trench was the rearmost trench, holding troops in reserve to be committed to the battle as needed. These main trench lines were connected by communication trenches running perpendicular, allowing for the movement of troops, supplies, and information between the different positions. The trenches themselves were not straight lines, but rather zigzagged or had protruding fire bays. This irregular layout helped to limit the damage from artillery shells, as the blast and shrapnel would not be able to travel far down the trench. In addition to the trench lines, the defensive systems included other key features. Dugouts were deeper underground shelters, often reinforced with concrete that provided greater protection from artillery bombardment. Barbed wire entanglements were extensive networks of barbed wire placed in front of the trenches to impede enemy advances. Machine gun nests fortified position for housing the deadly machine guns that dominated the battlefield. Observation posts elevated positions from which soldiers could monitor the enemy's movements. Latrines, kitchens, and medical stations supported facilities located within the trench system to serve the basic needs of the soldiers. Maintaining the elaborate trench systems was a constant and arduous task for the soldiers. The dugouts and other shelters required regular reinforcement and reconstruction to prevent collapse. Drainage was also a major challenge, with duckboards and other measures employed to keep the trenches from becoming waterlogged. The design and construction of the trenches also varied based on the local terrain and conditions. In areas where the water table was high or the bedrock was close to the surface, the trenches were sometimes built above ground rather than dug into the earth. In mountainous regions, the terrain itself provided natural defenses, leading to a more dispersed trench layout focused on key strong points rather than continuous lines. When the American Expeditionary Forces, AEF, arrived on the Western Front in 1917, they encountered a trench warfare environment that was entirely new to them. The doughboys, as the American soldiers were known, quickly had to adapt to the realities of trench combat, learning from their more experienced French and British counterparts. The AEF brought with them their own equipment and tactics, which were then integrated into the existing trench systems. The Americans also contributed their own innovations, such as the use of specialized trench mortars and the development of new techniques for assaulting enemy positions. The trench systems of World War I represented a remarkable feat of military engineering, evolving from simple improvised defenses into complex multi-layered fortifications. The construction and maintenance of these trenches was a constant challenge for the soldiers, who had to contend with the harsh conditions of the Western Front. The arrival of the American Expeditionary Forces in 1917 marked a significant turning point, as the doughboys brought their own equipment and tactics to the existing trench warfare environment. The integration of American innovations and the sheer weight of their numbers helped to break the stalemate on the Western Front, ultimately contributing to the Allied victory.